Hi guys, Sal, Spiritual Atheist back again. I got an email from a friend and fellow traveler. I like the term fellow traveler for who we are because it's a very apt description. So let's remove the negative connotations and just deal with what the words mean. And my friend and fellow traveler was being troubled by anxiety and said, of course, if he were in the present, then the anxiety wouldn't exist and he would be just fine. Well, yeah, I mean, that's true because anxiety itself is an illusion. It's, an energy. But at the same time, uh, it is part of the situation. And my response to him by email was, like, be sure you understand the difference between non-attachment and aversion. And I'm going to today I want to talk a bit about aversion because it's sort of a law that when things are bad, aversion will find a way of making them worse. And so if we try to avoid situations, the consequences are, it's just more pain, more suffering, if you will, more dissatisfaction, whatever. And incidentally, to flip the coin, the same thing is true of desires, that when the situations are good, we want to grasp hold and never let them go, sort of thing. That we want them so much that they, you know, turn to ash in our hands. I mean, it brings a dissatisfaction to what was otherwise a nice situation. So it is these two things that seem to really, we would be wise to avoid, so to speak. If we are going to avoid anything, let us avoid avoidance. It would seem to be a healthier approach, and it will help us to just embrace uh, the situation itself, because that's really what being in the present is. And also today I want to talk uh, about the samurai code. I've been wanting to take this on for some time, and I think about it and I've talked about it, but I've never got around to doing it. And I just, stick with me on this one. I think it's interesting. Now, the code of the samurai kind of lasted between 900 years, up until, well, they were in control up until the 19th century, but probably were really in control right into the middle of the 20th century. And that's seemed to be their problem, because the code of the samurai is, of course, for a particular class of individuals who were raised and trained up to be warriors. It was a warrior class, and it was a code for that warrior class, and as such had a great deal, has even today a great deal going for it. An example, let us say that two opponents are facing each other in a sword fight, right? And let's say that they're equally matched, they're equally skilled. Well, who's got the advantage? Well, let's say that one has one job to do only, and that's to strike down his opponent. He has no fear of death, no hope of winning. None of that is of any concern. All that he is concerned about is attack. And the other is wants to strike down his opponent, but also wants to live to tell the story. That's important to him. And he's the one that's at the disadvantage. And so they developed a code, they developed disciplines, they developed skills of not getting attached to life, that of overcoming any fear of death. And as it happened, there was a flip side, and we'll go into that further, but when you have this, okay, we'll teach non-attachment to a very few, and because we think it's the truth, we will also teach it as a gospel or as a code to others outside of the clan, so to speak. And there is when the trouble lies, because what they started teaching was a truth, and it led the samurai code, or those who followed it on a large scale, to turn into what became a national death cult. A very, very sad situation. But let's go back to the positive, what this came from. The code covers about everything. It tells you how to face your opponent. It tells you how to raise your children. Two rules for raising samurai children. One is never deceive them. Don't lie to your children. And two, never threaten them, which I find interesting and coming from a warrior class. There's advice on friendships and associations. One piece of advice is never associate with people who sneer, because they tend to be both mean and cowardly. You don't need them in your life. It probably still has validity today. There's something to be said for this. And then there is a command on armor testing. And it says there's no need ever to test the back of a suit of armor, because obviously no true warrior would ever show his back to the enemy. And that's probably okay when you're fighting with swords and at the most muskets. Not so hot when you're fighting a 20th century war, which is what the people decided to do. And what happened is that the interpretation of the code of the samurai does not translate into a national war, and as a result, the Japanese, who could have possibly achieved a limited version of their war aims, instead lost everything. And the fault, the real fault with the military decisions based on the code of the samurai. We never test the back of a suit of armor, because no warrior would ever show his back to an enemy. The Japanese had a great plane. It was the Zero. And yet they were not really a match for American planes when the Americans started really building good fighters. And the differences are not just a matter of performance, but of philosophy. A good fighter pilot is, worth his weight in gold. And in these cases, well, the Russians had women fighter pilots, but I don't think the Japanese nor the Americans did. So the fighter pilot is a sort of a national treasure. There's been a lot of time and money invested in his training, and if he's a veteran, he's even more valuable. The Japanese, though, would never put armor in the back of a fighter pilot's seat, which the Americans did. The back of the American fighter pilot seat could stop a 50 caliber round, but not the Japanese. Not because they didn't think of it. They knew these things existed. And not because they were callous either. I believe that the reason that these things weren't done, it was because the leadership did not want those pilots to feel that their leaders didn't have faith in their courage. Because the pilots are taught to seek death now, To seek an honorable death is the way of life. It's what's all valuable. Then to show them that we're trying to protect that life is a sign of not a sign of confidence. And the same thing went to their gas tanks. The Americans used bladders, which would allow a bullet to pass through, an incendiary bullet to pass through the bladder, but it would kind of self-seal and there'd be no oxygen for anything to start burning. The Japanese just had gas tanks. They knew bladders existed. These are not, weren't state secrets. They just had to look at planes that they shot down on occasion and see how they were put together, and they did. But that didn't change anything. And it went on to bigger things, like even their aircraft carriers. There was no fire control. There were no defensive measures, really, other than guns. And consequently, they were not able to flood their decks with carbon dioxide as the Americans were, and were able to save their ships. Ships were lost to the Japanese Navy for lack of a good fire control system. And well, I'm not going to go into this anymore because I just recorded it and I ran over time and YouTube kicked back, so I don't want to take any chances here. But, basically, again, what we talked about last time is that we have a situation where some people kind of discovered, hey, this really works, this is true, let's get everybody on board. Let's get everybody to agree with this truth that we had. They don't have to bother searching for themselves. We've done it. We've done the searching. Here it is. Here's the code. Here, all you have to do is follow. And it is, even though it had nothing to do with religion, it took on a total religious aspect in its most negative form and led to a destruction of a nation. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because if you go halfway around the planet, the Germans were behaving in more or less the same way as this massive death cult that once you had no fear and only will, you could accomplish anything. Hitler's book, Triumph of the My Struggle, and the best film of the time, Triumph of the Will, it is all about the willpower. You leave everything behind except your hate, so to speak. It is a disastrous effect of human insanity, and yet, we did that. We really did, and we are still doing it. We still have the death cults around today, and they are found in all the religions, and granted they're extremes, but they're also part of us. God, I don't want to run over again because they'd kick it off and I'd have to listen. Guys, I'm going to stop right here. Be kind to yourselves, really give it a shot. It works, and I'll see you next time around. Thanks for watching.